This is a video explanation of the reading comprehension passage about colonial feminism. This could be watched in conjunction with any question about the passage, and of course each question is explained in its own video explanation. And I'll say if you're doing several questions on this same passage, I would suggest doing all the questions before you watch this particular video, and that way you'll answer the question with your own understanding of the passage. So this is a long, complicated passage. It just has two long paragraphs. So the first paragraph, here's the beginning of the first paragraph. In exploring the role of women during colonial times, historiographers have taken several, though not necessarily conflicting approaches. Malley and Jemson represent those who have focused on the role of women in countries under colonial power. However, they are atypical in that they attempted to place the specific continent they studied, Southeast Asia, in a larger transnational context. So notice right there, they are atypical because they focus on a larger transnational context. So apparently, most of the researchers who are studying colonialism don't focus on a larger transnational context. Presumably, they just focus on a single country and they don't look beyond that country. For instance, in claiming that women in Annam, the name of Vietnam before 1950, had diminished economic power, even more so in their traditional role, which allowed for some economic autonomy, women's active role in the marketplace is cited, Malley and Jemson are able to make certain parallels with society in which colonial power rested, namely England and France. So that's interesting. So saying that women were limited in Vietnam reflects the way that they were limited in England and France, the powers which were colonizing Vietnam. And so there's this larger transnational pattern. That's what they're suggesting. Yet the eye for detail that makes their work on South Asia so compelling is lost in broad generalizations. Okay, that is a strong criticism of the author of this particular passage toward Malley and Jemson. In pointing out that it was deemed unladylike for women to engage in economic activity in both France and French Indochina, Malley and Jemson would have strengthened their case by offering specific examples from both parts of these worlds. So it sounds like they make a claim, but this claim is unsubstantiated. They don't actually provide examples, and so the claim is not particularly persuasive. Additionally, the greater question of how, in some cases, colonialism not only offered more freedom than did traditional roles, in real estate or women's initials, who are part of the deed, but it also limited women's freedom, would have made the discussion more germane to a transnational context. So that's interesting. If they had explored ways that colonialism both limited freedom and gave more freedom to women, then they would be saying something that was more applicable to the way that it played out over all possible nations and all the scenarios. So the author of this passage has a few criticisms of Malley and Jemson. But at the same time, it doesn't say that their work is worthless. It does say that their eye for detail, it makes their work on Southeast Asia very compelling. So that part is high praise. They do some things well, but other things not so well. Second paragraph. On the other hand, Camden and Greely draw broad conclusions in a transnational context. So again, they're also atypical. They're also focusing on the transnational context, but their understanding of this context is limited by their narrow focus on the history of a specific country. Such a narrow view, unsurprisingly, leads them to oppose certain meta-narratives on these countries. All right, well, that's interesting. For instance, in aiming to show that women in places under the colonial yoke acquired roles similar to women in Europe and later America, Camden and Greely relied on small island nations in the Caribbean to make their case. In doing so, the two not only compromised the scope of their findings, so in other words, they severely limited the scope if they were only focusing on particular nations in the Caribbean, but also they did not account for practices within these nations that might call into question the validity of their meta-narrative. So it sounds like these researchers already had this story they wanted to tell, this meta-narrative. Here's the big picture story we want to tell. And they looked just at two island nations and they kind of cherry-picked the information that would support their meta-narrative and ignored the stuff that didn't support their story. That's really interesting, and that's a strong criticism also from the author of this passage. By overlooking the aspects of the culture of the countries they studied, and by not including countries that were more representative of colonialism, Camden and Greely failed to concede that such meta-narratives might themselves need some more review to better account for more widespread practices. So in other words, because they're just focusing on a particular area and just looking at what they want to look at, they're acting as if their big story is really the truth. This is the big story. And they fail to see how limited it is, that maybe it isn't widely applicable because they're looking with such a narrow scope. Thus, the few parallels they draw between Caribbean nations and European powers are unconvincing. As both the approaches of Camden and Greely and those of Malley and Jemson show, historicity would be better served by scholars working in tandem to tease out general themes that apply to countries while also appreciating how countries' local culture informed and coexisted within such themes. So that's a really complex final sentence. And so if everyone were working together, if the people researching the countries, say in the Caribbean, were talking to the people researching the countries in Indochina and Africa and other parts of the world, then they would be better able to see similarities and differences, and they could draw more compelling conclusions about the transnational context.